Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Friday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Along with Jim Geraghty of National Review, I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. And yes, it actually is Friday, but we've still got plenty of news for you. Good, bad, and crazy news for conservatives, Jim. But before we get into our official martinis, you know, it was around the time we recorded yesterday that we started hearing that Trump's shortlist for the Supreme Court was down to 3 with Barrett and Kethledge and Kavanaugh. But, Jim, then we got some reports later in the day, so I think the list has probably expanded. Chuck Schumer has let it be known to all the reporters in town that he privately called President Trump and urged him very strongly to select Merrick Garland to the U.S. Supreme Court. So, Jim, this pathetic attempt to make Merrick Garland happen is still going on.
It's like the word fetch. Just stop it. Stop it. It's not. Stop trying to make fetch happen. It's never going to happen.
Merrick Garland's never going to happen either. But hopefully, given that the Democrats keep insisting on this, if they ever do get back into the White House, whether it's in 2.5 years or 6.5 years, that they lock themselves into nominating 70-something-year-old Merrick Garland if there becomes a Supreme Court vacancy. I'd be okay with that.
I have a feeling that for every opening from now until the end of time, for as long as Merrick Garland draws breath, some Democrat will be saying, "How about Merrick Garland?" The great irony is, of course, is how many Democrats could pick out Merrick Garland out of a police lineup?
Oh, very few.
It's become a mantra. It's a magic words that basically says, we got screwed over, and it's very unfair. Thus, you owe this to us to make up for it.
Yeah, the LA Times says he's the only legitimate choice as well, and I'm sure if Hillary Clinton had been elected, she would have picked him. No, she wouldn't have, and neither will any other Democratic president in the future. So stop trying to foist it on the Republican president. All right, let's move on to the good martini. Let's turn to CNBC.
Up 213,000 non-farm payrolls increased in June by 213,000. The unemployment rate rose 4.0%. That's the highest level since March of this year. Average hourly earnings up 0.2% month to month, up 2.7% year over year. We did have some revisions to both April and May. May revised up from 223 to 244,000. Adding for both months 37,000 more jobs for both May and April.
She forgot a couple important words in there, Jim. The unemployment rate did not rise 4% in June. It rose to 4% from 3.8% from the report in May. But 213,000 new jobs beat expectations, which were 195,000. And while we don't usually like to see the unemployment rate rise, this time 0.2%, this is actually a result of more people getting back into the workforce because they think the economy's improved to the point where they'll actually be able to find a job. 601,000 entrants to the labor force. And they believe that's also a reason for the jump in black unemployment from 5.9 to 6.5. So let's hope that the expectations are met here and these people are able to find employment. It's great that they're now looking to jump into this very positive job market. As you heard there, though, stubbornly slow growth in wages. So it could be better, but still pretty strong.
Yeah, I'm looking at another headline on CNBC that ran yesterday, sort of previewing the jobs report coming Friday morning. Says, America's labor shortage is approaching epidemic proportions, and it could be employers who end up paying the price. Greg, isn't that kind of the way it's supposed to work?
That's a bad thing.
Can't find a lot of good workers. You got to pay more. I suppose we could be, if by the way, if you happen to see people, we have a critical labor shortage. My goodness, we have no choice but to start hiring illegal immigrants. I'm just not going to buy that. I'm not going to believe that. There was a fascinating report. I think it was on HLN a few weeks ago, where they talked about the particular employment and finding workers for challenges for companies in the Midwest. They were talking to Wisconsin companies, where I believe the unemployment rate is now down below 3%. Scott Walker keeps taking his victory laps, although he recognizes his reelection bid is not a slam dunk. But they talked to all these companies in these places like Illinois and Iowa, and they said that as young people move out to the coasts, they're obviously going to California and Silicon Valley, going to East Coast cities, And they said, we have really ambitious goals. We really want to bring back these young people who've moved away. We want to get retirees to come back into the workforce if they feel like doing this. People who've been long-term unemployed, we want to get them back in. These employers kept listing off all these grand ambitions they had for getting more people to come out to the Midwest and work. And I remember thinking, that all sounds great. Have you tried paying them more? Because that usually works. That usually is okay, all right, they're hiring, they're paying a lot over there. Okay, quick, I'll go over there. It was kind of fascinating. I believe there's another report, I want to say it was on Fox News, where the farmer who talked about how difficult it was to find workers and how this was kind of the context of a report against immigration enforcement and how terrible the Trump administration was and how, farmers and businesses were struggling to find employees. So they asked the employer, the farmer, have you raised the wages that you're willing to pay? Well, no. Are you willing to provide housing for your employees because you're kind of out in the middle of nowhere? No. So basically, it's not that you have a lack of workers. You have a lack of workers who are willing to pay for the wages that you want to pay them. In economics, we might say that the market is trying to send you a signal. They're trying to tell you something. And what they're trying to tell you is you're not paying enough. We will see how things shake out from this. This is generally a pretty good jobs report. Nice to see the job creation rate continuing nice and steady. Nice to see people who had kind of given up on finding a job suddenly being interested and optimistic and preening. You can almost see them peering around the corner and saying, "Oh, there's a help wanted sign around the corner. I'm going to give that a try." That's all great to hear. I'd like to see the wage numbers go up because we've had this relatively low rate of unemployment for quite some time. We've heard businesses complaining about the difficult time finding workers. And we've seen wage growth inching up, I would say, not particularly exploding. In fact, I think you run the numbers in Wisconsin. Wage growth actually went down like $10 a week in Wisconsin, which is not what you'd expect to see when you have this exceptionally low unemployment rate. So, all right, employers, get on the stick here, guys. The country's earned a raise, I would argue, and when labor is in short supply, this is one of the ways that you attract higher quality ones. I think it's due here. So hopefully we'll get into good numbers on that. Also worth noting when you talk about the labor force participation rate, it's affected by a bunch of numbers, but one of them is the baby boomers are retiring. So we should expect that number to drop a bit more as the year goes on. Very interesting. I saw one analyst quoted in the USA Today article about the jobs report saying he thinks by the end of the year unemployment could be as low as 3.5%, which would be kind of a jaw-dropping figure. Hopefully we get there, and hopefully everybody who's working does manage to get a raise in the not-too-distant future.
Wow, 3.5%. That would be a jaw-dropping report. Perhaps the most jaw-dropping government economic report since the crop report on frozen concentrate orange juice bankrupted the Duke brothers back in the 1980s.
If it becomes the most surprising one, does that mean it's trading places?
Very good, very good. All right, let's move on to our bad martini now. And Jim, this probably doesn't surprise too many people, but yesterday the president tweeted out, "I've accepted the resignation of Scott Pruitt as the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. Within the agency, Scott has done an outstanding job, and I will always be thankful to him for this." He then goes on to talk about Andrew Wheeler, who will at least be the interim EPA administrator. In his resignation letter, Scott Pruitt says, "It is extremely difficult for me to cease serving in this role, first because I count it as a blessing to be serving you in any capacity, but also because of the transformative work that is occurring. However, the unrelenting attacks on me personally, my family, are unprecedented and have taken a sizable toll on all of us." Here's John Harwood of CNBC explaining the litany of allegations against Scott Pruitt that have now taken that toll.
The president said he's done an outstanding job within the agency, but that he is now leaving and he's going to be replaced by his Senate-confirmed deputy, Andrew Wheeler. I would not expect a big policy change for this, but it does relieve a huge headache for the administration in PR terms. Scott Pruitt has been facing more than a dozen ethics investigations for everything from trying to get his wife a job or a Chick-fil-A franchise to his use of security details and special favors regarding his housing.
So, Jim, this is a sad bad martini, but it had to be done. I mean, Scott Pruitt did some really good things at EPA. I think he single-handedly convinced President Trump to back out of the Paris climate change accord when everybody from Rex Tillerson to Jared Kushner and Ivanka were pleading with him to stay in it. So he did that well. He did the rollback of some of the onerous water rules and coal power plant rules that we really welcomed in the early stages. But when you've got this drip, 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 and from every story, from every angle, it finally does take its toll. Yes, it's true that there's a double standard, and Democratic cabinet secretaries don't get this type of scrutiny from the media. But if we're not going to like it, we're not going to like it, regardless of which party the cabinet officer belongs to.
Yeah, Greg, when they do the NFL pregame show on ESPN and sometimes in the postgame show, they have a segment they call "Come On, Man." And it usually features them, selecting some highlight or low light of the previous week, somebody completely blowing coverage, dropping an easy catch, running in the wrong direction, and they punctuate each sometimes comical low light with a "Come on, man." Scott Pruitt probably generated more "Come on, man" in this administration than any other figure. We've kind of come to expect it from a lot of other figures in the administration, but Pruitt was the one who knew the issues. Conservatives were just pumping their fists in the air when he was selected to run the EPA. He knew the policies. All of that stuff was fine. The problem was that once he stepped into the job, he seemed to think he had entered the royal court of Versailles or something like that. I mean, he just seemed to have this unbelievable sense of entitlement and this use of government resources for his own personal enjoyment. There's this very, like most people, they join the administration, they either buy a house, they rent an apartment. He ended up in this weird situation where he was renting from a lobbyist. He was getting way under regular rent and all. Okay, all right, fine, maybe Scott straightened that out. Then you got weird stories like they're trying to purchase the Trump hotel mattress underpriced. Using the lights and sirens to make sure he got his to the restaurant on time. Just lots of little things where you're like, look, you're the EPA administrator. You're not the president. You're not the vice president. You're not carrying the nuclear football. You're in charge of environmental regulations, and that's a great honor and that's a great distinction. And ultimately, you work for the public, and you have to kind of respect the taxpayers. We don't like it when the Obama administration did this. We really don't want to give you a pass for this. And there were lots of, it's very interesting. You look amongst my colleagues at National Review. We went into this really wanting to give Scott Pruitt the benefit of the doubt. And I believe last month it was just kind of the breaking point, and just recognizing that he just seemed to refuse to learn from experience. And every couple of days he seemed to step in this. And there's been this kind of, this narrative forming of, he wanted to do the right thing, but the deep state went against him, and there was these constant leaks against him. Well, I'm sure some of these leaks came from longtime EPA officials who are part of the permanent bureaucracy. But that having been said, my colleague Ramesh Ponnuru says, look, it was not hard to find people who came to Washington with Pruitt, who knew him from his Oklahoma days, who saw him as somebody who they believed in. And then month by month saw bad judgment, usually in terms of spending, usually in terms of the perks of the office and things like that just shook their faith in him. And they also believed that he was not doing a particularly good job of serving the president if every couple of days there's some new egregious story in the headlines about you spending money in some foolish way. I think a lot of conservatives, look, he had a long leash on this. There was a lot of people, because of what he was doing in the policy arena, who wanted to give him a break, who wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, but the examples just kept piling up and piling up and piling up. A lot of these are beyond the pale, but we're talking about, it takes light from this point several years to reach the pale. Was with hotel room bookings. He was staying at luxury hotels, and he had his staffers, mid-20-something folks, not making a ton of money, even if they're working for the government, put it on their personal credit cards, and he said he would reimburse them later. And of course, they did not reimburse them. I'll reimburse you later is like the most, you should reach for your wallet and just have the hairs in the back of your neck should stand up in circumstances like that. There's just too many examples of people, I'll pay you back. And he didn't. And, when you're the EPA administrator and you're making a nice, healthy 6-figure salary, you're not supposed to do that to your 20-something staffers. People were deeply disappointed in Scott Pruitt. Good riddance to him. It was bad judgment that just didn't get fixed, and he just wore out his welcome. People just got tired of making excuses for this guy. If you're going to get into a government role like this, you have to have better judgment than Scott Pruitt exhibited time and again.
All right, let's move on to our Crazy Martini, and it's a fairly complicated Crazy Martini. The trade wars have begun, Jim. You can tell your children where you were when they get older, and they ask you where you were when it began. We were on the 3 Martini Lunch. AFP, steep American tariffs on Chinese goods worth tens of billions of dollars took effect at midnight as U.S. President Donald Trump fired the decisive salvo in a trade war between the world's top 2 economies. Beijing vowed to retaliate dollar for dollar, immediately imposing counter tariffs on American exports, despite warnings the burgeoning conflict will send shockwaves around the global economy and strike at the heart of the world trading system. En route to Montana, aboard Air Force One on Thursday, President Trump erased any hope of a last-minute change, confirming the China tariffs would indeed kick in at the stroke of midnight. CNN's got a story out talking about the 1,300 products that are now going to be more expensive because the Chinese are retaliating in this tariff back and forth that includes meat. For some reason, CNN includes frozen beef under the category of poultry. They need a little bit of an education there, but still there's beef, pork, frozen chicken nuggets, dairy products, fish, seafood, including something called canned shark fin. I don't know if you've got that in the pantry or not, Jim. Tobacco, pet food, and beverages, including whiskey. But this is a tax hike. No matter what way you look at it, it's a tax hike on businesses, on American consumers. As you point out in the Jolt, though, today, Jim, the Chinese are a bunch of trade cheats, so it gets pretty complicated.
It does. And, of course, when you give people a complicated take, nuanced take on an issue, some people get irritated. Because somebody said, well, what's your solution? Well, I actually think these is a set of circumstances where there is not always an easy, simple solution to every problem that comes down the pike. Maybe, sometimes you're going to inevitably have trade-offs for this. For example, to use the recent hubbub with Canada, right? Canada's, particularly the western provinces, have subsidized their timber industry in ways that we think they should not do, that we feel gives them an unfair advantage. And the United States and Canada have been fighting over this for a long time. Now, we're not sending the B-2 bomber to nuke their poutine over this. This is not the beginning of a great clash. We've complained about it. They've said that this is something they have to do to protect their industries. We've argued it gives them an unfair trade advantage, and thus we're going to slap tariffs on them. They say if you do that, we're going to slap tariffs on you. Through several administrations, this has been manageable. And it's one of those things like we may not like the policy they have on softwood lumber. We now have to decide how much is it worth to you in the context of the overall U.S.-Canadian relationship to make a stink about this. There have been times, previous administrations have made big stinks about it. And there have been times they've been willing to agree to disagree because it's not worth, tanking the entire U.S.-Canadian relationship over this. In the case of China, but the good advantage we have is that if we were to put a lot of tariffs on Canadian goods, that would hit Canada pretty hard, and they might knuckle under. So we'll see how this shakes out. Trade wars, Trump famously said, are good and easy to win. And then shortly thereafter, we saw a Harley-Davidson motorcycle maker decide that they were going to move some of their production to Europe because of the tariffs that Europe was slapping on Harley-Davidson motorcycles in response to the Trump tariffs. Harley-Davidson said, well, look, in order to stay competitive, we have to produce some of our motorcycles over there, so they're no longer an imported good, and they don't have this tariff on them. And Trump just blew up at them on Twitter. He clearly took this as being stabbed in the back. He saw it as a great betrayal, and he just denounced them. And he said, they're going to pay more taxes than ever before, which goes right up to the level of abusing power. So the thing about trade wars is your greatest chance of success is with another country that is you're on good terms with free market democracies where you can apply pressure to their consumers, apply pressure to their industries complain, and that puts pressure on their government to negotiate and to lift the tariffs that they've had. The situation we have with China, if you believe trade wars are good and easy to win, you have to believe that I can inflict more pain on you and your population than you could inflict on me and my population. And maybe you have a chance of doing that with a Canada or a Europe. I think it's tougher with China because even though the Chinese government is very dependent on exports, or the Chinese economy is very dependent on exports, China's government is not a democracy, right? The Chinese government can set its course and set its policies, And then its wealthy ruling class can just kind of, hunker down, and they can wait out the storm for as long as it takes. And I think you'll see more pain for American exporters who have become dependent upon the Chinese market with all of their retaliatory tariffs faster and applying more pressure to American companies than you will see pressure on Chinese companies. Can't guarantee it. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know how it's going to shake out. But this contest of wills is tougher with an unfree nation like China. So we will see how this shakes out. Today, the tariffs go into effect. If you're a Republican running for re-election and you want to tout the low unemployment rate that we were talking about earlier in this podcast, you want to talk about how good the tax rates are, the tax cuts and all that stuff, all the complications and economic dislocation and pain that comes from tariffs and U.S. exporters getting hit hard, that doesn't help you. Now, I don't know if this will be enough of an impact on the midterm elections. Obviously, the economy is only one factor among many, but I don't think trade wars are good and easy to win. Having said all that, it is worth pointing out that China does cheat on its agreements. There's a long history of this. It was not Trump who invented this. The Obama administration filed a lot of these cases. The Bush administration filed a lot of these cases against a lot of countries, but in particular against China. Now, here's the good news for the United States. We won the last 16 decisions we've had at the World Trade Organization against China. The problem is it takes about 2 years to work through an agreement like that. And in a couple of the cases, like with chicken parts and stuff like that, China will just kind of tweak its rules. Oh, you don't like that tariff of 20%? Okay, we're going to take the tariff down to 10. Well, the United States is like, well, no, you agreed to not have a tariff on that. So that little modest concession is not really resolving it for us, and they end up going back to the World Trade Organization and having to fight over it for another 2 years. During all of this time, China gets the advantage of having this unfair tariff, of having this competitive advantage here. And my suspicion is this is a cynical and deliberate strategy on the part of the Chinese. They know they have a weak argument. They know that they're cheating, but they know it's going to take the World Trade Organization at least 2 years to decide because they can slow down the whole process. And if they someday have to rescind the tariffs, okay, fine. They still got 2 years of getting to enjoy it in violation of previous agreements. It's a thorny problem. I think Trump has a legitimate gripe that the World Trade Organization, even though it's ruling fairly, actually he complains that they're not ruling fairly. And when we're 16-0, I don't think we should be running around saying we don't think it's fair. I think it's perfectly fair. I think the problem is that the World Trade Organization doesn't enforce it particularly quickly, and it needs a better enforcement mechanism and things like that. So anyway, so that's where things stand. I don't think the trade war is going to help Republicans. I think it's going to cause headaches for the Trump administration. It's certainly going to hurt American consumers. Look, if it makes China knuckle under and suddenly rescind all of the unfair practices they've been doing against U.S. exports to China, terrific, wonderful. I just don't think it's likely that Beijing is going to knuckle under anytime soon, Greg.
I'm just sitting here staggered that an international organization is so entrenched in bureaucracy that it takes 2 years to resolve a trade dispute. I'm shocked. Just don't have the words.
Well, the irony is that they brag that they're faster than every other international organization. That on average, it takes 9. My suspicion, the reason it runs with China is that they're probably more complicated. And of course, China can slow down its responses to all of these requests for information and collection of data and things like that. But by comparison, you want to hash this out through the United Nations or other international groups, World Bank, things like that. WTO's the drive-through lane, man.
And they actually end up making the right decision, unlike the UN and some of these other organizations. So I guess we should be, I don't know how thankful we need to be for that. Jim?
We should be thankful that it works the way it's supposed to. Yeah, that's how low the bar is now.
Jim, have a great weekend. Talk to you Monday.
See you Monday, Greg.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. And be sure to tune in again on Monday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.